India, we're going to Bollywood and how Bollywood and affects the shaping of the nation. The Fauji's actually boast that there are many armed forces brats in Bollywood, and these include some of the starlets like Aishwarya Rai Bachchan, Priyanka Chopra, Sushmita Sen, Gul Panag, Preeti Zinta, Anushka Sharma, and Nimrit Kaur. Each is as impactful and fiercely as the next and has a warrior spirit and self confidence imbibed in them from childhood, being brought up in the Fauji atmosphere. A purge of the well ensconced names in Bollywood and the drug trail which Hunt has put the stars and star kids in focus, even though for the wrong reasons. Films and star personalities have an impressionable impact on the millions of viewers, both in India and overseas. It is a force that cannot be overlooked.
Can there be an all-out purge in Bollywood? What impact will such actions have on India's image and the film industry? Some questions also arise or point fingers that in the face of Chinese turbulence and far-right nationalism, will Bollywood produce a Reni Riefenstahl? Incidentally, for those who may not be aware, Reni Riefenstahl was a German actress and film director. She was a Nazi sympathizer whose political leanings had severely damaged her career. Do we have a Leni Riefenstahl amongst us in Bollywood?
Moderating this panel is Nirupama Subramaniam. She is an editor of the Indian Express at Mumbai and she writes on political and foreign affairs. After 2 stints as foreign correspondent, 7 years in Sri Lanka and 4 years in Pakistan, she has an abiding interest in India's relations with its immediate neighborhood. She has written a book on the Sri Lankan War, Voices from the War Zone, published by the Penguin in 2005. She is presently working on a crime non-fiction book.
Shubhra Gupta. Shubhra is a film critic and senior columnist with the Indian Express. She watches world cinema for enjoyment, Hollywood for fun, and Bollywood for work. She's been writing a hugely popular weekly column in the Express for over 20 years and is one of India's most well-known and respected film critics. Additionally, she writes on the cyclical, continuous connections between cinema and society. She's traveled extensively within and outside India to cover film festivals since the early 90s. Shubhra has served on selection panels and juries on the Panorama and the international film sections of the International Film Festivals of India. She curates and conducts a hugely popular platform, the Indian Express Film Club in Delhi and Mumbai. Shubhra has been the recipient of the prestigious Ramnath Goenka Award for Best Writing on Film 2012. Her first book, 50 Films That Changed Bollywood, published by HarperCollins, is the repository of her work and knowledge over the past 20 years and shines a mirror on how films change us and we change them.
Dr. Makaran Paranjpe is a columnist of Swarajya, Mail Today, DNA, The Print, and the Magazine. He was earlier a columnist for Sunday Observer, Business Standard, The Pioneer, and Life Positive. He has published over 175 academic papers in various journals and has edited books within the country and abroad. He is the author of several poems and short stories, book reviews. He has written over 500 essays. He has been teaching undergraduate and postgraduate students for over 35 years across the globe, largely in the United States and India. He was the general editor of a series of reprints of rare and out-of-print Indian English titles published by the Sahitya Academy, New Delhi. The founding trustee of Samvad India Foundation, a Delhi-based non-profit public charitable trust, and also the founding editor of IVAM, Forum on India Representations and International Biannual Multidisciplinary Journal on India. He was the chairperson for the Europe and South Asia region for the Pan-Commonwealth Panel of Judges for 2008 and 2009 Commonwealth Writers' Prize, and served as Indian host judge for the 2010 prize awarded in New Delhi.
Our last guest is a surprise in the true Bollywood spirit, and that is my co-host, Major Bikramjit Kavarpal. Major Bikramjit Kavarpal served the Indian Army for 12 years. He's second-generation Armored Corps officer. His father, Colonel Kavarpal, is a Gallantry Award winner who won the Kirti Chakra in 1963. Bikramjit has served in Rajasthan in temperatures of plus 45 degrees, to Siachen Glacier, which is the highest battlefield in the world at 21,000 feet in minus 40 degrees. He has operated in Punjab during Operation Rakshak, when terrorism was at its peak in Punjab in 1991-92. He is a qualified paratrooper and has experience in de-beaching operations of tanks at sea. Being an active soldier, he took premature retirement in 2002 because he suffered an injury and became a medical category. He then moved to Bombay to follow his passion to become an actor. He has done over 150 TV commercials, about 50 films and web series, and numerous TV series. He is also a military advisor and a consultant for Army films, and has advised on films of critical acclaim like 1971 and Shaurya. I now hand over the forum to the moderator.
Good evening, everyone, or good morning, or good afternoon, as the case may be, because people are joining us from around the world. It's my pleasure to be the moderator for this panel. Firstly, I'd like to thank Chandigarh Lit Fest, the organizers, Military Lit Fest, for remembering me and inviting me to be part of this panel. I have a long association or a recent association with Chandigarh. I was the editor of the Chandigarh Indian Express until recently, and I was also part of the first Military Lit Fest. So it's a great pleasure to be back, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. The topic of this panel is very current, and it's, as people keep saying, it's a hot, burning topic. And, it's not an old thing, this relationship between state and culture, the various representations of culture, be it art, cinema, music, dance, whatever. It's always an ongoing and complex saga. It's been like that through history. Everywhere culture has some form of state patronage. It is needed that to flourish, especially if the practitioners do not have their own resources. And history is replete with examples of this kind, where rulers, kings, queens, rich people, business houses, being patrons of art and culture, and their association giving these cultural forms and their practitioners some kind of popularity, respectability. But when we come to films, it's a slightly different equation, because the popularity of films is very much driven by its appeal to the audience. And the audiences are mass audiences. They are people. The success or failure of the film is not determined by having state patronage or by having a rich patron somewhere. It really squarely is dependent on how it goes down with the people who see it. And if it's it's a film for the masses, then it is the audience that determines it. Still, with its potential for this mass appeal, nation states have, at various times, in various epochs, they have sought the cooperation of filmmakers, film personalities, and they have received it as well. Examples, the anchors just mentioned examples from Nazi Germany. I could mention examples from the United States, post-war United States, post-war England, Soviet Russia, and so on, and France, and so on. So some of this, what I was coming to say is that some of this cooperation may not even be actively sought. It's there because the makers of films are in tune with the mood of the nation at any particular time, or they are in sync with the people who are driving this mood. For instance, a government, or take the case of India. The earliest films were actually inspired by the freedom movement. There's that beautiful song from Kismat, Aaj Himalay ki choti se humne lalkara hai, dur Hato, Dur Hato, Hindustan Hamara Hai. And there's a map of India, undivided India at the back. So this is still 1943. It's been inspired by the Quit India movement. It's supposed to be, there's a reference in the song to Germany and Japan because India is in the war effort, but actually the British are also watching the movie closely because it has a message in there for the freedom fighters as well. So that's where the Indian film history begins, and then even after independence, the spirit of nation building was a predominant film among filmmakers, except that they changed tack a little. I mean, they did this by focusing inwards and addressing the social ills that beset the new nation. So there were themes like Hindu-Muslim unity or rich versus poor, caste. These movies were made by public-spirited movie makers, and though they focused on the country's ills and drawbacks, they were well received. Some of them were hits. Some of them, of course, didn't do that well, but there were lots of films that did extremely well. And Major Kamarpal just mentioned the army, and Hakikat was one of the best war films made in India, and it was made in the aftermath of India's defeat at the hands of the Chinese in 1962. It was made in 1964, and its ultimate aim was to kind of make a bad thing look good, defeat look somehow as if we had snatched a victory out of that huge demoralizing defeat. So it was about one particular operation in Chushul, in which we did better. We lost a lot of men there, but we held on to that particular post. And it was also a very layered kind of story. It wasn't all black or white. It was made in black and white, but it wasn't a black and white film. There were lots of layers in it. There was the inadequacy of the Indian response. There was the lack of clothing. There was, the horrific conditions in which people had to fight. And the movie was also, even for all that, the movie was funded by the government. So the give and take between Indian cinema and the state and the Indian state has gone on. Whatever the political differences between the government of the day and individual filmmakers, and not just in India, across the world, there is this relationship. In India, films have accurately reflected the spirit of the nation in their own way. I mean, I'm not saying the great films all the time, but they have accurately somehow reflected the nation's twists and turns, its drawbacks, its successes. So the portrayals of the romantic hero and the angry young man, or the new aspirational young, all have been part of this. It's only when a government has wanted to impose its own political will, make this film, don't make that. This is the real India, not that. That the tensions have tended to erupt out in the open and take center stage. So one such moment was during the emergency, when political differences between the government of the day and prominent personalities in the film industry, they came out in the open. There was censorship. Attempts were made to make actors and filmmakers fall in line, and also a film like in this Valley to Indira Gandhi got made. I think there were two parts to that film. I was actually taken by my parents to watch that film, and I remember that my memory of that film is that my sister threw up on my clothes. So it was really horrific. I have a very vivid memory of that. So now the recent actions against Bollywood personalities through most of this summer and still ongoing, first in relation to the Sushant Singh Rajput suicide case, then in relation to allegations of money laundering still related to that case, and then then about drugs, also related to that case, but then going on separately and saying, the NCB saying that we are going to dismantle this citadel of drug that is Bollywood. It created a climate of fear and tensions in the film industry about, as somebody told me when I was writing an article recently, it's created this whole thing about a sense of siege in the industry, about who's next and to what end. And so there is a feeling in the industry that this is attempts are being made to arm twist them into making a kind of film that hews to a certain political vision of India or a certain party's vision of India, or that attempts are being made to dismantle the existing Bollywood and recreate it in a after vision that the powers that we may have. That it is an attempt to purge Bollywood, as the anchor just mentioned, of people, themes, storylines that do not comply or that do not have a place in their vision of India. So this throws up a number of questions. How does this impact creative freedoms? What makes a movie tick? What makes a star tick? Is it possible to actually dismantle Bollywood and then make it all over again with stars and movies that, after a certain around a certain political line or around a certain vision of India, would these things have mass appeal? Is it all, or are we all overreacting, and are we all imagining that all this is going to happen? This is the subject of today's discussion. I've gone on too long, and you have been introduced to the panel already. So I will hand over to the panel, and may I, because Shubhra is a colleague, so I don't want to go with her first. Shubhra, is that okay with you? I will go with, and Major Kanvalpar has also a role as an anchor, so I will go first with Professor Makarand Paranjpe. Thank you, Professor, for being with us. And of course, you're very well known. And I see you all the time on Twitter, tweeting about this or that. And I would have loved to come to IIAS had I been in Chandigarh and had a powwow with you, but maybe someday. I hand it over to you now. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a bit disconcerting to be known only by what one tweets, which is really very secondary to what one does. In fact, unfortunately, the incidents you mentioned, whether it's Sushant Singh Rathod or the allegations of drug abuse, I think that we've got a very distorted perception of some of these things because of social media. So one has to step back a little bit. I will revert to these topics and the anxieties that surround them, but I think that what attracted me to this panel was the title of the panel, which was, if I'm not mistaken, Bollywood and the Shaping of the Nation. So I thought that was a very significant issue. And you rightly pointed out how cinema has been deeply integrated with our sense of who we are. And if you look at the literature on Bollywood or Hindi cinema or Indian national cinema, I mean, it's been pointed out over and over again. I'll mention a couple of books of great significance. One is, of course, a book by my colleague, Sumita Chakravarti at the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana. I think that was really the first book on this topic. It's called National Identity in Popular Indian Popular Cinema. And then, of course, Madhav Prasad's book on the ideology of Bollywood. I think ideology of the Hindi film, a historical construction. I think these two books set the stage for a discussion like ours. And if one is familiar with these books, and of course, if one is a viewer of Hindi cinema or any Indian cinema, then it'll be absolutely clear that cinema bears a very close relationship to what's happening in society. You might even say cinema mirrors society. And You know, the Nazi filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl, who was mentioned, she was a very talented, very gifted filmmaker, by the way. If you see films, they have a deep artistic and aesthetic impact. Whatever ideology they supported is a different matter. And I'm saying that some of our great ideologues of today are really very bad filmmakers. Now, the thing I want to say, I want to make 2 or 3 very quick points that it would be very incorrect to assume that suddenly we have got a political over-determination in Bollywood. Actually, this has been there throughout. If you see Avara, you know, an early film after the independence, a kind of villain is Justice Raghunath, who represents these structures of imperialism which haven't been dismantled. And his own son is being disinherited. Similarly, if you see Sri Charsobis, it's about Nehruvian socialism, people coming from the villages into the city, not having housing, you know, living on the streets in Mumbai. If you see Naya Daur, again, it's a competition between the local landlord capitalist and the noble peasant. You see Do Biga Zameen, the villains are the big capitalists, you know. So, and let's not forget that films were influenced by IPTA. There were leftist writers, Khwaja Ahmad Abbas, Sahir Ludhianvi. You know, all of these came from that leftist background. And in fact, the center of cinema earlier was Lahore, and after partition, it shifted to Mumbai. That's how the Kapoors and all the big clans which ran early Hindi cinema also came from there. And what's fascinating is if you see the progressive writers, you know, a lot of them were associated with cinema. Ismat Chughtai, her husband was a film director. And Khwaja Ahmad Abbas, of course, used to write for Raj Kapoor. So the point I'm trying to make, and think about Sadat Hasan Manto, you know, what a great storyteller. Now, all of these people worked in Bollywood, and what they lost in terms of their own politics, they lost because Pakistan was created. They were not in favor of Pakistan. They were progressives. They did not want a communalization of Urdu and of Urdu literature. And for some time, they also moved to the other side. They moved to Pakistan, they found it stifling and came back. So the point is they lost politically, but they gained in the literary field. And they went to Bollywood, and they constantly portrayed a certain kind of India. If you read Pyasa, you'll see, again, the lyrics of Sahir Ludhianvi, the stories written by a largely leftist set of people who were, in their own way, they were reflecting the values of the nation. Think about Mother India once again. And as some of my friends have pointed out, all you have to do is to look at the villains in Hindi cinema to see how cinema has progressed. So earlier, before independence, the villains were indirectly, because you couldn't directly criticize the British, they were indirectly the British. They stood for the imperial colonial administration and rule. As you pointed out, Dur Hato, Dunya Walo, Hindustan Hamara Hai. And then after independence, the villains were the landlords, the money lenders. Like in Mother India, the big villain is the money lender. And that's what makes one of the children of Mother India become a dacoit, right? And the other one actually becomes a politician. So the villains become landlords and capitalists, like in Do Biga Zameen, money lenders, those who are obstructing, 5-year plans, Nehru's idea of an egalitarian India, and of course the communalists, right? Those who separate people, because Nehruvian secularism, etc. Then if you progress further beyond Nehru, then the villains actually become, dons, criminals, mafiosos, people who are subverting the state and its welfare policies, again, big industrialists. And the heroes become vigilantes like Zanjeer, the angry young man you mentioned. And you move further up, then the villains actually are politicians, because there's so much distrust. There's so much of a gap between the people, rulers and the ruled. So the trust deficit is then displayed on celluloid. And if you move further up in today's times, many of our films are set abroad. They're very little to do with what's happening in India. But films like Laksha, they all target, let's say Islamic terrorism or terrorism in general, or people who are threatening the state, 27/11. So what I'm trying to say is that it's nothing new if cinema reflects the dominant ideologies of our times. And even historical films earlier represented the Ganga Jamna Tehzeeb, and all our Mughal emperors were shown to be so liberal, you see Anarkali, you see Mughal-e-Azam and so forth. And the terrible history of medieval India with its vandalism and, genocides is never shown. Or caste oppression is never shown. In Bollywood, you hardly ever know the caste of a person because their last name is Kumar or something, So difficult questions are elided, right? And obviously, when the regime changes, you'll see a film on Jhansi Ki Rani, Manikarnika. So these are not things to be very alarmed by. I want to mention one more point. The alternate cinema was completely dominated by leftists, whether it's, except for Satyajit Ray, who was a class by himself, but Mrinal Sen and, Sham Benegal, Kumar Shani, Govind Nihalani. And let's not forget, a lot of these films were funded by the state. You're talking about state funding. Luckily, we don't have state funding today. I mean, the government is not in the business of, funding movies. So all this so-called alternative cinema, if you look at, and the award winners, these were all state-sponsored, and FTII, if you saw how FTII shaped Indian cinema, you will see the ruling ideology playing out there. Now let's come to the point that you were making. Is there an alarm now of the possible purge of Bollywood and, creative freedoms being interfered with? I think the answer is yes and no. I mean, I think the greater fear is that international studios are taking over Bollywood, whether it's Disney or Sony and Netflix and Amazon and all these people, they are taking over our cinema. And if you see, 4 More Shots, if you see all these films, you will see that they are being, there's a narrative that's being controlled by the funders once again. And let's not forget, just a few years ago, a lot of underworld money used to come to Bollywood. It probably still does. It's reasonably well documented where this money was coming from. And this underworld money was also promoting a certain kind of film. And you'll see that many of the underworld dons have been immemorialized in cinema. They've been made to look like Robin Hood, dispensing justice and doing good at the local level. And money laundering has been a part of Bollywood because huge amounts of money, unaccounted money, come into Bollywood. Cash payments are made to film stars. They're underreported. When I was growing up, I remember 97% taxation was there for the highest bracket. And we always heard about the income tax sleuths haunting the bungalows of Bollywood stars, Ashirwad and Juhu and Varsova, and the dogs being sent on them, and money coming out of mattresses and so forth. So I think all of this is grist for the mill. And let's not forget, a lot of Mumbai is still being controlled by the Shiv Sena. They also have a stake in the film industry, and you dare not say anything against them. Bal Thackeray himself, in his own ways, was a very civilized and talented man, a great cartoonist. He had a great sense of wit, and the film stars loved him. I've seen interviews with all the film stars went and did Ji Huzur to him. All of this is known. It has been broadcast. So this is the world we live in. There will be arm flexing. Political parties and their agents will try to influence content one way or another. Now, should the whole industry be demonized? Not at all. Should there be excessive curbs? On the film industry, not at all. In fact, there's a new book that's come out. Shekhar Kapoor and a friend of mine, Aarti Tikku, has written that book. And they're actually saying, don't censor these platforms like Netflix and Amazon Prime and Sony Live or Live. Don't censor them. Have them do their own self-certification, which we see today. They'll say nudity, sex, etc. And then when you see the film, there's no nudity really. So I mean, they're excessively cautious these days. I feel. I see, some Netflix and Amazon Prime myself because of COVID. So to sum up, what I'm trying to say is that artistic freedom must be protected from state interference, regardless of who is in power. And I think that people like you who are in the fourth estate, I think I have tremendous respect for Indian journalists, though of course there are claims that they are also compromised. And I think it's true to an extent, but still by and large, I think our media has an important role to play. And unfortunately, just to sum up what I'm saying to conclude, when it came to Sushant Singh Rajput, there was a media trial, which was so unnecessary at one level, and nothing has come of it. We don't know all these allegations that were going back and forth. I think it trivialized and sensationalized something that is much more important, which is cliques, lobbies in Bollywood, which control production, and they can ruin the careers of stars they do not like. Unfortunately, these cliques persist everywhere. In publishing, in academics. I'm an academic. I've been a dissenter in JNU for 25 years, 20 years plus. And if you're a dissenter, you have to pay a price for that dissent. Woe begone to you if you're a dissenter of the official modes of dissent. So there is the dominant, then there's the dissent, and then there's those who dissent against even the dissenters. So there is a price to be paid for dissent. So what I'm trying to say is that content in Bollywood is a part of a larger narrative war or a narrative competition that's taking place in India. It's about the idea of India, and Bollywood is not exempt from it. And it's not merely a matter of politicians controlling Bollywood or political parties or the state power. I think the control of Bollywood or on Bollywood is by a variety of other agents, including deeply entrenched cliques, studios from abroad, money that comes from known or unknown sources, and of course, as you rightly said, Nirupamaji, ultimately, audience is king. I mean, you have star children being promoted, but they flopped. I mean, look at Kumar Gaurav, he was very well promoted as opposed to Sanjay Dutt, just to give you an example. So audience is king. And this is the great carnival of India, politics, Bollywood, and cricket. And I think that carnivals, the carnivalesque, as Bakhtin said, has a way of defying authority, of cooking its snook at authority. I'll stop there. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Paranjpe. You brought up some very interesting points. Mainly, I think the point that you made about how Bollywood was, had this great leftist influence at the beginning. Sahir Ludhianvi, K. Abbas, Kefi Azmi, so many people. And IPTA, the influence of IPTA itself on filmmaking, many of the actors came from there. And now we are seeing, but Bollywood has moved from there, and as you said, it now mirrors the realities of India in its own way. It has been doing that. It has been very deeply integrated with all the realities of India, the many layers of India. And the most interesting thing, of course, is that, how you brought up this thing about international studios and international OTT platforms were now that are now seen as that are in these times when there are no new releases possible. Indian cinema has actually discovered these platforms. Of course, international studios have been there from before, but OTTs have been a revelation during these last 8 months. And they're even seen as liberating in a sense, because there's no censorship. Movies have been able to go up on it without any policing by any system. But we've also seen a pushback, and there are now demands within many quarters in India that there should be censorship of this. And you also alluded to the fact that there shouldn't be. And I'd like to now invite Shubhra, my colleague and reviewer par excellence. I mean, she gives 3 stars and there's a stampede to the movies, and then if she gives 1 star, it's all over for that movie. It's that kind of power. She's been an influencer before the term actually came into vogue. So I'll ask Shubhra to take that discussion forward and maybe also talk about OTTs and how they've changed the shape of Indian cinema, or maybe they're still changing, and whether in that kind of situation any control is possible at all by a political party or a government that wishes to exercise such control. Thanks.
Thank you, Nirupama, and hello. I'm very happy to be here, and I almost didn't make it because when I got a call yesterday saying that could we please have you, and I had back-to-back screenings today, and I've just about managed to squeeze an hour and a half, so I may have to run, but I'm hoping that I can, push my last screening of the day a little more so that I can be part of this. So just a little bit of some kind of an introduction for what actually I do. I review films, yes, and I have been doing that for many years. And when people ask me how many films I've watched, and I always tell them that if I started to keep count, it's almost impossible to have a count of something that you've been doing for over 25 years. So so what is now called Bollywood was Hindi cinema. And I come from a time when Hindi cinema was sort of, has always been on the brink of change and has always grappled with things that are happening in society, as Professor Paranjpe very rightly pointed out, that when you have cinema, it's not like your filmmakers are from another planet. They are you and me. They are people like us. They look at stories from within us, from outside of us, from things that happen in newspaper headlines. So many filmmakers have told me that the germ of an idea of a film came from the news of the day, much before television actually even existed, that they used to read newspapers and headlines became, the subject of the film. So almost always there is a very, very strong connection between the way we watch movies and the films of the day, because how we watch and what we then talk about the film as a conversation around the film goes out, and it sort of reaches the filmmakers' ears in many layers, and it sort of gets it becomes part of that conversation about the next film that they do, and it's like a cycle. It's like a cyclical thing. And the other thing that I have noticed in all of these years is that there are really no absolutes when it comes to making movies or watching films, because the government of the day will always try and impose their view on both filmmaking, the narratives that the filmmakers are pushing out, as well as the star system themselves, as well as the actors and the stars. It's too tempting to not have some kind of a direct access to this body of people who have an inordinate influence on the country. As we all know, it's cricket and it's Bollywood, and that's it. It's between the two of these entities that the enormous numbers of people are affected, are impacted, are influenced by these two things, sports and cinema. So when it comes to the state taking a great deal of interest in what cinema is doing, it has always been the case, right from Nehru's, you could call it idealism or call it his idea of India. But in the 50s, there was a very clear mandate to the filmmakers to create cinema which was about nation building, which was about creating mainstream popular cinema, which was about looking at India as a composite creature, not these little bits and pieces of principalities which were fighting with each other, or Patel actually did a great job in creating the India that we know, but there were still people who did not want to be part of this, and it was a very clear mandate. And there are, I remember researching for a paper, and I remember that looking at a story in the Hindu, which quoted Nehru as someone who said, we need this kind of cinema. So that's how the 50s happened. It was the whole idea of India, the idea of a composite culture, the idea of a country which was together, even if it hadn't been together for so long, and it had been in different, every 100 kilometers, language changes, dialects change, cultures change. It's many Indias in one country. So to have a cinema that actually addressed this India was really a challenge. And I think the filmmakers of that time, including the people from IPTA, people from the Khwaja Ahmad Abbas, the Ismat Chugtai, all of these people, they were leftists, but they were also artists. They were also primarily artists who had a very strong sense of the literary tradition that they were following and they wanted to develop. So it was not a leftist takeover of cinema, as a lot of people say. It just so happened that their ideology and their creative aspect kind of got very strongly linked together. And yes, a certain kind of cinema became the norm. But they were always, and this is something I want to emphasize as much as I can, there have always been disruptors. And there will always be disruptors. There will never be the one narrative, because it's a creative process. There are so many people who are creating so many stories. So there will never be the one. There will never, because that immediately, the pushback is a modern word, but people back in the 30 years back or 40 years back were getting, you have a formula which really does well. Bollywood or Hindi cinema or all cinemas across the world are very, very chary of sort of pushing the boat or rocking the boat. It's a thing of, if it is not broke, why fix it? So there one film comes along which is a huge hit, you will have 100 Me Too's. There will be copies of pale copies till there is a pushback, till there are people who will say, okay, no more, I don't want to see this. Along will come, and this is the thing, along will come a filmmaker who's just waiting for this opportunity to see this subject is now done and dusted, so let's get another kind of cinema. And this confluence is also very interesting to me, that one kind of film, the fluffy film, the La La Land film, the films where heroes did not have surnames. And that is why I always look at Dilwale Dulhania Le Jayenge, which is the first modern so-called post-liberalization film which had both Shah Rukh Khan's character as well as Kajol's character and gave them surnames. It gave them a location, it gave them surnames, it gave them a place. They were not just these, Meenas and Vijays. Meena and Vijay were both part of Pyasa, but and they were also very, very rooted people. But in the 60s, the cinema that everybody was watching in India, which came from Bollywood, from Hindi cinema, was the kind of cinema where a lot of the fairy tale-ishness, the popcornishness was at its peak, when Shami Kapoor was dancing, Sharmila Tagore was singing, they were rolling down the hills and all of that stuff. In the 70s, when the emergency came, it was like it was like a different India, right? 1975, and everything changed. 73 to 75, the kind of things that were happening in this country, all of us were, I mean, we may not have been journalists at that time, but we knew what was going on, right? And as Nirupama had mentioned, that there were people who were talking against the state, and they were always excoriated. They were always, All India Radio was told not to play Kishore Kumar songs. Devanand, who was against the government of the day, was told, to behave himself. Morarji Desai was told to tell him to behave himself. All of those things. So they've always been, the state has always been the intention of the state is always never to be heavy-handed, but always to be like, hey, we are watching you, and do not overstep your line, which is why the CBFC exists, which is why I have been part of the Central Board of Film Certification and for 3 years, and I've seen how it works on the other side. So it's not like anyone will say, don't do this film, but they can make things so difficult for the filmmaker that the film will never see light of day. So that is one wonderful way of, keeping everything in check, because you cannot be seen to be saying that, okay, this is the film that you need to make, because that really is an overreach, and that becomes a stretch. It almost never happens. But I've seen how filmmakers can be in really difficult positions. So that is the other thing that I wanted to say, that no narrative can be a one size fits all. There have always been disruptors. The parallel cinema, or the alternate cinema, or the middle of the road cinema, or the art house cinema have always been as posited as alternatives. If you were very tired of doing another kind of song and dance, and the cops coming last, and everything happening in a villain's den, you could always go and see the film. But those films did not really have theaters at that point. In the 70s, there was maybe one theater in Delhi, and maybe one in Bombay, and maybe one in the other bigger cities. But other than that, there was only state television, which contradictorily, they were films which were examining state policy, they were critiquing state policy, and they were getting 11 p.m. slots on Doordarshan, because there was really no other way to watch those films. A lot of us remember watching many of the films that we now consider classics of the of the 80s, when NFDC was called FFC, but Film Finance Corporation, where they did give money. In fact, Jaane Bhi Do Yaron, which cost $50,000, was given a lot of its money to Ketan. They gave that NFDC gave money. So a lot of the movies that Ketan Mehta made, for example, Shyam Benegal made, even all of these filmmakers were critiquing policy. They across the board. There was poverty, there was hunger, there was disillusionment, which very deep that had gone down. All of these films were getting money from the state, because it was considered important for filmmakers to have an idea of the kind of thing that they wanted to do, and the push came from. But the problem at that point, like I said, was where did we see those films? There was hardly any place. From then to now, when you have, of course, there's been COVID. 2020 has been a year which has upended all our notions about how we watch. In the last 9 months, in fact, I've been telling people that I have watched more than I ever have in all my life, because I used to go to the movies and come back. Now the movies have come home to me. There is no silo. I can't create silos and say, okay, this is my movie watching day and not the others, because I barely get a chance to take a breather. And then I'm either watching a film that comes from India, or it comes from across the globe, because when you look at your home screen on Netflix or Amazon or Disney Hotstar or Sony Live or anything, you will find one film that comes from here, from Argentina. So the riches are enormous. The universe has opened to us, but at the very same time, many people are now saying there is nothing to watch. Yes, there are all these films, but what do we watch? So it's not as simple as getting this access to all of these films, and you're going to have to. My job is to watch, so I watch. But a lot of us are actually looking at something that we want, and no Netflix or Amazon can give you that. A filmmaker can. A filmmaker who knows, what the kind of cinema that his or her audience wants. Something like a Rajkumar Hirani, for example, who's no longer making movies at this moment in time for various reasons, but he was the last filmmaker to have made a mass film which sort of went out to major parts of the country, because now we all live in pockets. Everyone's making films for a particular kind of audience, so that all India, pan India hit that used to happen as a matter of course has now started to get very, it's become almost non-existent. So to have a platform like this where you have you have so much choice is actually quite fantastic. But at the same time, I will also a cautionary note here that not everything is to be watched. And two things before I give the the mic to my next panelist, just to say that the people from outside of this country have been trying to get a foothold into India. As far as cinema is concerned, it's not been an easy ride for them. 25 years back, when I was starting to to do this as a profession, Hollywood's presence in India was 4%. Literally, now it is 11%. All of these years later, they have much more of a penetration in something like a China, for example, which is why China keeps, raising its walls higher and higher. We in India, we like watching our movies. We are very happy with the kind of films that we make. We want to watch our own movies. Hollywood will come. Jurassic Park will 93. Jurassic Park was the first film which really made Sony some amount of money. So the 2 or 3 films that in India which do well, which come from the West, one is a creature feature, something like a superhero film, and maybe an adventure film. That's it. The rest of it, you can talk about, rom-coms, all of that stuff. We want to watch our own movies, when it comes to people talking to each other, people creating romances around each other, all of that stuff. So Warner Brothers, Sony, all of them in about 12, 15 years ago came into India starting to want to produce movies, and their hands got so badly burnt that they backed off. So now they are only in distribution. And the only way that they can increase that is to have one more subtitled, print of Spider-Man 6. That's about the only way they can come in here. Otherwise, we are very happy with the kind of film we make, though we make a lot of trash, but Hollywood makes as much trash as we do. All mainstream cinema make a lot of trash. And that is, my trash could be your treasure, so it's entirely out there. And the last thing, to also say that as cinema of the day keeps a close eye on what is happening in society, the last 6 years have been, in that sense, as far as being able to tell the stories of what is happening around us, have been a little less forthcoming than they have been before, because there has been a very strong directive from the government of the day, which understands the power of the image like no other government that I have seen. They understand one single tweet that can go out into the ether, and the force multiplier effect of one image is something that this government understands better than anything else I have seen. So they really are right on top of it. And even if they want to, but here's the thing, they may want to control it, but I am not so sure they can control it only up to a point, because it's a massive thing, and every kind of person who is a storyteller may not want to go down the path, may not want to be proscribed or to be told what to do, because there will always be other avenues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shubhra. That was really insightful. And I think you made a very important point there about how Bollywood is not a monolith. There are very many people, there are very many actors, actors in the sense, there are very many elements in Bollywood. And trying to take over Bollywood for any single political entity or government, to take over Bollywood would be like trying to fix all the players in a match, which doesn't happen, which is impossible to do, as we all know.
Yeah. It can happen for 12 hours. It cannot happen beyond that. So
it cannot happen all the time, and you cannot control everything. So that was very important to say, and I think you spoke about that at length, and also the fact that despite all these platforms and all the things that are coming in now, OTT platforms and Hollywood studios, they still don't have that much that big a share of the pie as they would like, because there's enormous viewership for Indian films and in all languages. And I think the thing that has happened in the last few years, the last 10, 15 years, is that is across India there's an increasing interest in and viewership for films in languages that viewers don't necessarily speak. For instance, I think North Indian languages happily watch a Malayalam film now. I watch. I'm Tamil, but I watch Marathi films. I watch Bhojpuri films. So just out of interest, some of them can be very bad, but you watch all of them because you're interested and you like to see all that. And I remember in your discussion in the film club discussions, you have audiences. You take this film club across the country and you play movies that are not necessarily Hindi films or in the language of that particular place. So, and you have large attendance at these places. I'm now going to move to the next panelist, Major Kamar Pal, who's an actor himself. He's ex-military, an actor, model, and he is going to talk about something that has really come into its own, the military, the Fauji film. He talked about how there are Fauji brats in movies were stars, but actually there are more and more films being made about the military. I think we've seen this since perhaps Kargil, that this military film genre, how people either want to join the film or there's scenes out of a battle or. The heroics. Uri, I think, was a top grosser last year, Shubhra, if I'm not mistaken. And so these are the films that are being made, and he has his take about how people take liberties with history, with accuracy, with uniforms, and there have been many run-ins like that. My own question about it, which I'd like him to address at some point, is how if having too many military films increases the appetite for war, if it actually becomes it militarizes society in a sense, and if it constantly indulges in an othering. In my own interest in the neighborhood is coming in here, and I just want to understand if these films, by constantly dealing with people across the border as hostiles, whether this border or that, are actually creating an entrenched view of people around us as all enemies forever. I'd like him to address that. And I hand over the mic to you, Kamarwal.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. First of all, I'd like to talk about films, and like everybody said, cinema has been one of the most influencing factor when it comes to us humans. Whether it's not only India, whether it's Hollywood, or whether you talk about the good old days of the westerns. To the tune of the kind of clothes that people wear and the kind of hairstyles that people would wear. So notwithstanding the fact that where cinema heads, one thing has to be very clear, that it is the most influential media of conveying feelings or conveying kind of a genre where people will understand where they're heading. Coming to this, I think that the governments that come to power tend to kind of utilize the same thing. towards to their advantage. Coming to your first point, is they do want to come in because they do understand the value of cinema as its influence on the public. They do want to use that influence, but unfortunately, I don't think they will be able to ever impose their thoughts on cinema. It's a very independent thing, and no matter how much they try, it is such a forum that cannot be controlled by anybody as such. Yes, we have our boards of censors, and who can control things. We also have a few parties like Shiv Sena, like somebody just brought out, who had a huge ruckus played over water on a film that was to do with lesbianism, which doesn't appeal to their sense of cinema, and they thought that it was going a little overboard. Yeah, barring that, I don't think they will be able to kind of they would not be able to have influence on it, but yes, they will impose a few kind of restrictions on some things, and that too via the censor boards to gain whatever advantage they can, and whichever the government is in power. The last I was hearing gravitas, and this lady was talking about, why is the US called the promised land, and why not India? And she also talked about the cinema, that the kind of cinema Hollywood makes to the kind of cinema that we make. Coming to that point of view, when I see Hollywood, if you look at Hollywood when they make cinema on Vietnam, which is actually the worst debacle that they've ever had, and it couldn't get worse than that. But yet, they have made films like Rambo. They have made films like, out of Vietnam, and then they made Hurt Locker out of Desert Storm and stuff like that, which actually promotes them, and which is a highly influencing factor. And that is why the uniform abroad, especially in the US, is respected a lot more than that is respected in this country. And I can tell that from personal examples. Cinema actually follows events. So when they were 65 and then they were 71, so they were like war movies that came up on 65 and 71, and then came Kargil and then Uri. So I think it's a event by event making of films, and we forget some of the things that we should have made, because there's much more to just the 71, 65, and an incident like Uri. So we have Siachen, and then we have the Valley, and what actually happens there, and how our soldiers deal with it. So there are varied subjects that we can deal with. I personally have written 2 scripts on those subjects. Coming to the second part of the media, which we talk about, is also TV, which has a greater viewership. Now, this is where when I do TV, I look at the scripts and I say, are they really hitting it the right way? The problem is that is what sells. Some schools of thought come from people like me who say, what you will feed is what you will get. So when I look at the TV soaps that we produce, not that Hollywood soaps are any better, but yes, we do produce some really bad TV soaps, which are like actually trash to me. But now the point is of changing the viewer's mindset, and that will happen gradually. There was a film, like we said about, like I talked about influence, was a film called Fana, where Amir Khan becomes the hero, even though he's a terrorist, and he finds love, and he finds love, and he's the hero, and he dies a glorious death in the end, whether he's shot. But the point is the death of that terrorist is glorified to an extent. And what happened there was that I got several of my course-mates were at that time serving in the Valley, and they said, you know what, we find these CDs in homes of these Kashmiri village boys, who then want to be the jihadis and say, well, if he can do it, so can we. So that's the kind of influencing factor, and that is where I find that filmmakers must understand a kind of a philosophy, a kind of a responsibility towards the public itself. Now, somebody talked about liberty and said, they will be at liberty to make cinema. But I feel that there is, especially to do with the uniform and army cinema, we have a lot that's going wrong. In the process of making cinema, it is called the cinematic liberty, and the amount of cinematic liberty you take, you just take it, blow it out of proportion. The problem is that the uneducated masses that see their film actually, they start believing what they see. And that is actually a very misleading factor. I think we need to be a little more careful in the way we project, especially the uniforms. With the topic that you just talked about, saying that, too many military films will, cause a rupture across the borders and all, and I don't think so, because I feel it gives a rise, it raises the patriotism factor amongst the people, which I don't see otherwise in this nation. If you realize that, the whole nation suddenly comes together, suddenly when a Kargil happens, and the whole nation suddenly comes together when a Uri happens. But it's not there, which the spirit of the spirit of the nation should just speak by itself, and not because of these particular incidents. So I think these films need to be made, not for any other, because these are the films that talk about the supreme sacrifices made by the people. And that's the reason that we breathe in peace. And that's the reason we hold these festivals. And that's the reason that we make cinema at peace. So I don't think there is anything wrong or like it'll cause a further disruption between two countries, whether you make it against Pakistan or, well, that's the only country I feel that, at this juncture is promoting. And it's a worldwide known factor that they promote terrorism. So, that's what I want to say about, cinema that should be made and how it should be made and how we should be careful in making it. Thanks.
Thank you, Major Kamarpal. You raised some important points there about patriotism and how cinema should constantly strive to raise the patriotism quotient of the country. I just want to, if I may, I think I'll start with some questions to the panelists, and I want to start with Professor Paranjpe about this very question of patriotism. When we talk about films to do with nation building, is there a certain definition of a nation building film? Are there certain parameters? What would you consider as a nation building film? For instance, is Dilwale Dulhaniya Le Jayenge not a nation building film, but Jhansi Rani Manikarnika is a nation building film? I mean, why is one a nation building film, and if the other is not, why is it not? I'd like you to talk about this. Just to sort of extend this a little. I was talking to somebody in the RSS when we were working on that story, and he said that Bollywood is soft power. We have to project soft power, and here is a country here's an industry that goes out to the rest of the world. It is seen everywhere across the world, and it has to represent the right image of India. I want to understand if there is such a right image, and if so, what is that image of India, which we have to project outside?
I have to unmute myself, yes. I was going to say there are as many images of India as there are people. Now, there are obviously groups of politicians, political parties, other outfits, which have a well-defined idea of what they want to project. So if they want to pay for it and produce a film, and then if it's commercially successful, so be it. But I think the questions that you raised earlier are very significant. For example, the militarization of society, is it being promoted by these sorts of films? Now, I want to draw your attention to films which are more complex. For example, we mentioned Laksha. I mentioned it myself. You can mention Border, Hakikat, which is a much older film. But what about films like Haidar or Shaurya, which is about a court martial and talks about human rights abuses in the army? Now, these are much more complicated, Or there was the other Hrithik Roshan film, which Vidhu Vinod Chopra made, Mission Kashmir. So my point is that as the previous speaker, Major Vikramjit ji said, I think some of these topics are extremely sensitive and portraying our armed forces in a negative light. There are some repercussions. Now, as for the police have been trashed in Bollywood. I mean, villain after villain is a police commissioner, bribe taker, whatever. Now, police are also people in uniform. They also give their lives for the country. I mean, you go to the police memorial and you'll see hundreds of thousands of policemen have died, since independence. It's not just our soldiers who die. And apart from that, there are paramilitary people, BSF, CRPF, and so forth. Now, again, these are sensitive issues. I saw this film, what's it called? A Bollywood film where a general is being court-martialed because his daughter is raped, and I think Tom Cruise plays the role of the investigating officer, and he doesn't spare the general there. So I don't think as a democracy we should be afraid of self-criticism, self-examination. And, the army has a lot of secrets. It has a lot of things which they don't want the outside world to know. But if you have friends in the army, so many things go on, there's fair and foul in the army as there is everywhere. But we are not supposed to talk about it, obviously. Now, patriotism, another thing. I think Major said very rightly, if you see a film like Border, you're very fired up, What if you see a film like Razi, where the Pakistani people are being praised, and their intelligence and this and that. So, it all depends on your point of view about artistic merit, artistic freedom, patriotism, what is right, and what should be projected, and who's to tell and who's to impose these matters. But to answer your question, I definitely think society is getting more and more militarized. The military, its triumphs, its sacrifices are being harnessed for political purposes. Just as you said, Bollywood is being harnessed, just as cricket is being harnessed. So, we can't shy away from this. We see more and more military people on the media. They are on the shows all the time. They are experts on all kinds of things. And there are, people who have taken early retirement. They're anchors today. They're influencers. And they're being exalted. And former army people are ministers today. So obviously, there is a much greater presence of the military in our national consciousness. And has Bollywood contributed to it? Absolutely. Has the media contributed to it? Absolutely it has. Is it a bad thing? I don't know. I mean, earlier bureaucrats and foreign service officers, they were ruling the roost. I mean, they were constantly commenting. Even today, you read the Tribune, which is a sponsor. Look at the number of retired bureaucrats and army people who are writing columns. Every day, there's some bureaucrat, some IFS officer telling us what to think. I mean, op-ed pages, right? So do you mean to say that such people can be dislodged from their extremely privileged positions in a democracy? No. So, I mean, the jury is out there. But I think what is really important for India as a democracy is to keep the separation of powers. We don't want a coup here. And I think our army is so professional and they don't interfere in politics as long as they're in uniform. I mean, and this is the greatest thing about the Indian army. They're powerful, they're smart, they're strategic, they know what's going on. But as long as they're in uniform, they don't get into politics. Completely opposite of our neighbors, where the ISI and the military, they control that country. You know that. 60% of the GDP of Pakistan is consumed by the army one way or another. So I think as a citizen of this country, as an intellectual, as a writer, as a thinker, I'm very proud of this distinction, this separation. You know, this is a country where basically we elect our leaders, and even if our politicians are whatever, I mean, they are, and our politicians have been slammed in cinema. You know that better than me. So they are open to criticism. They have a very difficult job, you know. And the politicians I've met, I respect, because they have one of the hardest jobs I know. They're constantly in the media. They're constantly in the searchlight. If they lose an election, they're nobodies. It's a hard life, and it's a difficult profession. And of course, there are rewards. But what I'm trying to say is, as long as we elect our leaders democratically, and the leaders, and do legislation, laws are passed, and there's the judiciary, there's the executive, and there is the legislature. This is how our country, the separation of powers, and there are the forces. It's extremely important. And think about the police. The police have got politicized. Today you heard about IPS officers being called by the center and resisting it. The police forces are under state governments, right? I mean, ideally they shouldn't be. Why should IPS and even judiciaries are state cadres in a way, So we need the separation of powers. Judiciary should be independent. Police should be independent. Unfortunately, police are politicized. But I'm so happy, I'm so glad that the army still is apolitical. And I really salute our generals and the leaders of the army who decided, and they still maintain that tradition of staying out of it, They had times when the country was very vulnerable politically, and they could have intervened, but they didn't. So I think that for me is a very important thing.
So, Shubhra, if I may bring you into this, and the same question, if I may ask you to weigh in on that. What is a patriotic film? I mean, what is a nation-building film?
Can I just come in for 1 second, Nirupama? Just one second.
Yeah.
Because I think that, both you and Shubhra have said a couple of really important things, and about this. Now, Shubhra rightly said that our films were about national integration, okay, under Nehru. And that's the article she quoted from the Hindu, that films should promote national integration. They should promote secularism. So that was considered the patriotic film. Now, what you mentioned about Dilwale Dulhania Le Jayenge, you see, is that a patriotic film? That's the film which defines the diaspora. You see, that's the film where the diaspora comes of age because they have the money power. A film can become a hit if it does well abroad, as you know. So the diaspora becomes an extra territory, apart from Delhi and Bombay and CP and Berar and all those old territories of Bombay, of the film industry, how films are sold. The diaspora is a huge territory. So you have a different idea of India as projected from the diaspora. And there are hundreds of films like that now, So, I don't want to steal my, co-panelist time at all, but I just wanted to emphasize that there is no one kind of patriotic film, okay? And each government will try to plug its idea. Now we can talk about the, the glories of Hindu India, and Jhansi Ki Rani, Rana Pratap, Shivaji. Let's make many films about them. And I say, why not? If you make films about Akbar, let's make a film about Hemu, who ruled for 17 days. Why not? Let people know. The more, the merrier. So there's no one template. There's not one size fits all. Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Professor. Shubhra, if you'd like to weigh in on the same question, is there one sort of template, one of patriotism?
So it's Nirupama, I think you really asked one of the most interesting questions that I have, in the last so many years about what is it that makes a film patriotic. Now, I think a lot of us, or too many of us, use the phrase patriotism / nationalism interchangeably. It's not the same thing. It's not the same thing, because when we're talking about nationalism, we're looking at a nation and a broader, much broader idea of what a nation should be. And when the early filmmakers and the early settlers, the people who had crossed over from the pre-British times, I mean, when they were making movies at that point of time, and they had to be very careful of the British censors to be able to say many things about things that were not allowed. So they created codified language, or they created codes to be able to talk about freedom struggles, or to talk about freedom, or to talk about many of the things that would pass the British censors by, who were only worried about people talking about freedom struggles, people talking about getting together and fighting the British and so on. The thing about the CBFC, or what used to be called the Censor Board, which is now called the Central Board of Film Certification, when it it rolled over, and in 1953-54, when it started to take shape, a lot of the British idea about keeping a very strong hold on filmmakers crept into the making of that, of the creation of the censor board of that time. And in all of these years, in my 3 years on the board, and as a practitioner from the other side, there have been attempts where people have said that the Cinematograph Act was created in a different time. It was in the mid 50s, and we are now in 2020, and it needs to have a complete overhaul. You cannot have a set of rules, and these are all guidelines, by the way, right? And it's the censor board, and it's the adjuncts that actually you're supposed to interpret guidelines, and you could be a liberal, and I don't mean the word liberal in the way we have come to use it now, in this sort of very pejorative manner. But if you are someone who believes that if do not cut out, if you do not like it, do not cut out, but look at what you do not like as something that comes from another point of view, and engage with it in a critical manner, so that you can understand what that person is trying to say. So actually what the CBFC should do, the mandate is to hand out certification on what the film is about to say. So for example, if a filmmaker has made a movie and wants a use certificate, which is what is the most useful thing, because it can go straight on to state television, which will not show you an adult film, and the satellite rights are a very, very important part of a film's the kind of money that they can make. So when the CBFC actually hands out a certificate which the filmmaker doesn't want, then it becomes a problem for the filmmaker, and then there are procedures put in place where the filmmaker can say, no, I don't agree with this. Then there is a second level of certification that happens when a board member is mandatorily on that another next 5 people who look at the film, and so on. So anyway, so instead of getting I just wanted to give you a broad idea of certification and censorship, and the kind of the way that the board actually looks at their mandate, which is simply to certify, but a lot of it is used to censor. A lot of it is used to say you cannot do this. In fact, I keep saying this to people, that as an adult, the numbers of times I have heard the word allow in my 3.5 years on the board was like, we cannot allow. But why? No, we cannot allow this because people will not understand it, or your people are not, will take it in a different manner. And my question to that, or my response to that, has always been that instead of what that does is to infantilize an audience. You do not. Are you saying that an 18 plus person who is allowed to vote, who's allowed to marry, who's allowed to procreate, is not allowed to then watch something that he or she wants? I mean, that it's patently absurd, right? So the idea to me is never to have a kind of you give yourself the power to tell someone that you can or cannot watch it. Rather than that, I would say that we should, and I've always maintained this, that we should be talking to the audience, and we should be in the business of making an audience more aware of what they are going to see. The responsibility is not just of the filmmaker. the filmmaker has responsibility towards their own shareholders now, because now that it's all corporate and the fattening the bottom line, that is basically what they are interested in doing. Their job is not to create a safe space for you to go and see a movie. That is the audience's responsibility. And a lot of the times I find that people are very happy to point fingers at the filmmaker and say, dekho usne kaisi picture banai hai. You have to look at yourself, train the lens on yourself, and see how much work have you put in on yourself to be able to look at an image that bothers you, or it doesn't sort of align with your own set of values or the kind of things that you think are right or wrong. If that is something that is happening on screen, how do you respond? Do you react or do you respond? Okay, as a react thing, I mean, you can react and you can do a knee-jerk thing. And if you are in a position of power, you can say, we cannot allow this. But then we are continuing to infantilize our audiences. We are not going to give them the power which an adult has anywhere in the world, and particularly in our country. We pride ourselves on the fact that, hey, we are free to do so many of the things that many countries in the world cannot even take for granted. And then we want to keep this little power to ourselves. So I find that problematic, and I find that one way of dealing with this, whether it is the army or it's the judiciary or it's the police or any other organization which has really thin skins about how they are portrayed. Because if you have even if something that goes wrong, and you have somebody who writes off to their MP or the MLA and saying this is not a good thing, so the MP and the MLA will then bring it up in Parliament and say this is not a good thing. So then the INB minister will then tell the CBFC person in charge, how did this happen? So there are processes. All I'm trying to say is that this business about telling people what they should watch, must watch, what is allowed and what is not allowed is a thing that we can do when there are children. I was a Nazi when it came to children below 12. And if any film that tried to sneak in anything that I thought that kids below 12 should not watch, it didn't matter to me which filmmaker it was. I would say, like, this is out. We throw this out. Okay. But when it comes to children, at adults, between the 15 to 18, we have something called a U/A, a universal stroke adult, which is a very complicated area to traverse, because you need parental permission, which you can't show in writing to the guy at the gate and say, haan, mere parents ne bola hai. But the assumption is that your parents or your guardians know that you're watching this film, and that you have the metrics by which time you have grown up to create your own standard or your own metrics of what you think is right, what you think is wrong, what you should be watching, and what you should be wary of. And you should go back to your to whoever it is who's in charge of you and say, I watched something that I was disturbed by. How do I respond? So this, I think, is the most important thing, is something that we've lost sight of in all of these years when we talk about media education, when we talk about people who are, like film appreciation, for example. I'm a big votary of starting film appreciation for children as young as 5. Why are they not being shown films which are nation building, what is considered nation building or considered good cinema, and to have conversations, because children at 5 are very sophisticated consumers of the image. They understand much more than we think they do. That is one point. And the other is, when you were talking about Dilwale and any of the films that are, that have been markers of how Bollywood has grown. Dilwale was directed by Aditya Chopra, who was the scion of the Yash Chopra, the house of Chopras, and Yash's son, who had come back from a US degree and wanted to make his first film. And yes, it was very, very clearly aimed at an NRI audience. But it was very interesting to me. But the second part comes back to India, comes back to the Punjab, it comes back to the Parandis, it comes back to the safe space of the Chaijis and the Baujis. And so it has both. It has a modern India. We had never seen a pair like that before, who were not chaperoned, who were left to their own devices in Europe. It's, they didn't have 10 girls who were around Kajol's character, or didn't have 5 boys around Shah Rukh's character. They did have them for a bit, and then for at least half an hour, they're left to their own devices. It had never happened in a Hindi movie before. All right. So it was when we watched it, it was modern, it was fresh. And even if you watch it, it completed 25 years in October 25 last 2 months ago. And there was a big outpouring of love and critique of that film. But what it did to me, it made Hindi cinema, turned it into, and for me, that turned that Hindi movies, Hindi cinema became Bollywood after that film. Because very interestingly, a lot of the thing about taking permission from a parental figure to be able to be with the love of your life turned the whole idea of rebellious love on its head. It became the template. In the last 25 years, rebellious love has gone out of the window because DDLJ was the movie it was. It created such an impact. It created such an impact that you don't have, the two people running away together or eloping. There was a story that I had written about how it had become very difficult to be a rebellious, pair after Shah Rukh Khan and Kajol's character. And also after that, every single film that has come in as a romantic film has always paid some kind of tribute to that film. So yes, of course, it is a nation building film because it changed the whole idea of how romance and how love and how you grew up and how you take that first step into adulthood by putting everything on the same page. And a lot of people have also said that, okay, it's one way of looking at saying that, rebellious love was thrown out of the window, but it was also a kind of negotiation that Shah Rukh's character makes with Amrish Puri's character. So it's a kind of adulthood where you have someone, you work on them and they come to your side rather than saying, okay, this is it, I'm gone, you're gone, and we're never going to talk to each other again. That's one. And the other is that every other film that has come, for example, something like a Dil Chahta Hai, okay, which was the first film in Bollywood, which said that it is okay to be rich, that it is okay to have money, that it is okay for you to lounge in your living room. It is okay to spend your father's money and to jump into a Mercedes coupe and go off to Goa because you have the money. Okay. First time. It had never happened before because people who had money were deeply, suspicious characters. They were dodgy. They were either smugglers or, having money and flaunting it or flouting it was completely not the right thing to do. So that was, again, a marker. And many, many films after that have been at each step when one of these very significant films have come up. It's something that I wrote in my, I have the one book to my credit, which I call the 50 Films That Changed Bollywood, which Harper had brought out 3 years ago. So in the last 25 years, there have been so many films that have actually aligned themselves with the things that were happening in the country. Post-liberalization, brands were coming in, malls were coming in. We had cars other than Fiats and Ambassadors. All of those things started to, show up in our movies. And part of that was also then they were being celebrated, like wealth is celebrated in Dil Chahta Hai, and so on. So I think it's a question of both things. There are, the films will always pick on stuff that, because a film is a thing of its moment. You can look back at a film and you can have a critical appreciation of it, but a film will always be the most significant when it comes out.
Okay, interesting, Shubhra. I just want to say one thing about the diaspora with that Professor Paranjpe mentioned, which is that it caters to diaspora because diasporas are markets, but diasporas have also been part of the new nation building. They are vote gatherers. They are fundraisers. They reach out to the powers of the countries that they live in. They influence those governments on our government's behalf. They are used by our politicians to reach out. So in that sense, that's also a kind of nation building. And the other thing that I just wanted to raise in this thing is that the whole idea, you mentioned national integration. I just want to ask if the opposite is happening right now. I just want to push the envelope a bit, and I want to ask if the opposite is happening right now. If there is now a certain divisiveness at play by for instance, we have seen in this movie, help me, Shibra, I just forgotten the name here. The one in which Ranbir Kapoor was the Muslim invader, and Deepika was the.
Yeah. No, it's Padmavat.
Padmavat. I'm sorry,
It was supposed to be called Padmavati, but Padmavat. And yes, you're right about the demonization of the other. It's no longer the enemy. It's the enemy is the demon. It has no redeeming features at all. Right?
It has no redeeming features, and it is demonizing a particular community. There used to be something called the Muslim social, that is not there anymore. Then there are no national integration films of Hindus and Muslims or of any other religions. Are we going to now see? I'm just throwing it open to the panel. Are we now going to see films in which love jihad will be sort of a theme, in which there'll be cops going and stopping marriages between Hindus and Muslims? Will that be the new template of a romance or a non-romance, or what? I mean, I just want to understand. And another thing that I wanted to ask Major Kanwarpal is, you talked about Vietnam, you talked about Hurt Locker. I remember seeing Zero Dark 30, and I was actually impressed by how Hollywood could bring in a lot of criticism. Professor Paranjpe mentioned what are they called? A Few Good Men, I think it was called. The movie that you mentioned with Tom Cruise taking the generals to task. I mean, in a court martial, perhaps. I mean, are those films ever likely? Do you think the military will ever allow those kind of? Hurt Locker was really about PTSD, and a lot of the films about Vietnam are about PTSD. That we have seen. So these are very, very sensitive issues for the army. And I think, to its credit, Hollywood has been able to make those films without actually raising a furor about, no, these go against our national values, these are against our army, they're all against patriotism. Are we ever going to see films like that?
I was just about to come to that point when he mentioned about this film in which Tom Cruise court martials the general, and then there was just a film I saw on Netflix was The Green Zone, where the government is doing something wrong and the army is involved, and there was another film on the same lines. But what you must understand is the US of A actually has never fought its own battle. If you notice, all their battles have been on somebody else's land. That doesn't hold good for us, because our soldiers are fighting on two fronts and protecting us on two fronts as we speak right now. So you cannot compare the US government as to what they make about their soldiers. Yet they make a classic amount of films. But the point is, ours is an active operation to save our own country. But theirs is a fight for somebody else. I mean, if they go to Iraq and fight, it's not their battle. Nobody's coming attacking the US of A, except for like the Twin Towers went down. Yes, I can understand a terrorist attack. But there is no legitimate war that they have on their borders. So they can take the liberty to make these films. But the moment you do that with the Indian Armed Forces, who are actually guarding your borders, it's very demoralizing to do that. And you must understand that it can, but on the other hand, I also agree with Paranjpe sir that, when he said that, what about the police? I mean, they die too. I understand that. And I think they should raise an objection to it. Finally, it's a democratic country and they're allowed to raid. But yes, we have made films like Shaurya. They were an offtake of another film. I'm the advisor and consultant of that film. And I understand that, yes, one odd case can happen and you can make one odd movies, an odd movie here and there. But if you start making a movie which is constantly hitting the army on saying that to, they take advantage of the uniform and stuff like that. It can actually demoralize the army to quite an extent. The other point of yours that you were trying to say was, what are the nation building kind of movies? And amongst those, I can name a few like Super 30, Raid, Padman, Toilet Ek Prem Katha, Dhoni. And there was a movie called Matrubhumi, which was like, to me, one of the finest movies, a very dark movie, but it was to do with, the way in Haryana and in some states, they kill the girl child. And the movie was about, how the village or the township is left with only one woman, and the father is protecting her. And finally, how she gets married into somebody, finds out, and she gets married. So these are films that can be of greater influence, and that's all to do with nation building. But yes, to criticize a force that is already sitting at the borders for you, for the US, it's okay because they're on somebody else's soil and fighting somebody else's war, which may affect them, in politically or economically, but they do not affect them directly. That's my point. And as far as the other movie that you talked about, where they see the Hindu-Muslim pact and all, there's been a movie by Salman Khan himself. When he joined, which one, the Bajrangi Bhaijaan, where in the end they show that, both the countries are the same. So yeah, there are movies like that. That's
right.
I hope I answer your question.
Yeah, thanks. That's good. The insight about fighting our battle and then fighting other people's battles is interesting. Professor Paranjpe, you are eager to say something.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating topic, and I'm not so sure that I agree with the distinction. You had great films like Apocalypse Now, which critiqued the Vietnam War. And
Yes.
There are films which continuously critique US engagements. Guantanamo Bay figures in so many, self-critical takes, and the CIA is constantly being criticized. And now, FBI, everything is under scrutiny in a free society. But now I think the question is, can we impose restrictions? I think that is a key question. The film, by the way, I was talking about, in addition to the Tom Cruise film, I think it's a film called The General's Daughter. It had John Travolta in it. And then the films that you mentioned, look, Chak De India was a very patriotic film. Lagan, it's about team building. Lagan is about bringing people from all kinds of backgrounds. Though some people say Kachra is a very bad name to give to somebody who bowls a Chinaman or a googly. So yeah, there are all these films. But what I'm also saying is, I want to take you on. I think national disintegration also sells. Now, I'm in JNU, Tukade Gang, etc. All these things have a lot of traction, If you make a certain kind of film or a short, or if you write a certain kind of book, if you're plugging a certain kind of line. Now, I've been following the reports on the farm protests. The overwhelming number of reports are in favor of the protests. I track op-eds just for fun. I write op-eds myself. Are we trying to say that there are no lobbies at work? Do we mean to say that Omedia Network and all these networks are investing, Soros, independent media people, everything is being funded? In other words, what I'm saying is there's a huge funding behind narratives, and you can't get that out. You can't stop that, is what I'm saying. So I think that, this is a tussle. And apart from individual conscience, like I may have my views and I may resist certain kinds of, whatever influence. Have you seen a site called Muckrake? Or is it Muckrake? All of you, Muckrack, sorry, I'm so sorry, Muckrack.
Yeah.
All of us are in it. They tell you if you're an influencer or not. They're telling lobbyists, suppose you want Miss Subramaniam or somebody to write a particular article. They've tracked all your stories, all your tweets. So people are tracking you even as we speak and monitoring what we say. So we can't get out of the fact that we are in a surveillance society. But I think that as citizens, as people who have values, I think we have to stand up for certain things. And I think what we stand up for is things like artistic freedom, freedom of expression, And as I think, I agree with Major that there has to be some self-imposed regulation, especially. And I like what you said, Ms. Gupta. You said we always infantilize our populace. Either we say, oh, they're villagers, or we say they're illiterate, but they're probably smarter than us. So this overprotection is something I'm completely against. Who are we to decide? And similarly, why should we cocoon our armed forces? They're intelligent enough to see what is propaganda, what is not, etc. So I'm a Swarajist at heart. In other words, I want the people to be empowered. I want power to devolve to individuals and to communities and to those who make democracy, not networks, corporations, politicians, political parties, film lobbies, other lobbies. So I'm all for that, of that unlocking of the spirit of the nation, if you want to call it that. And there are hundreds of ways of doing it. And certainly being self-critical is very important. We have to be self-critical. Not everything, like I'm in a field in academics, okay? And everybody's saying Jagat Guru Banna hai. Wow, you're going to be Jagat Guru, but look at your standards. In JNU, I've taught, only postgraduates, okay, MA, MPhil, PhD. They can't string 5 sentences together. This is our truth. And we say Jagat Guru banenge. I mean, it's great. Okay, at one time we were at the top of the world. We are a knowledge society. But how do you encourage knowledge? You have to have excellence. You can't have excellence if everything is caste and community and this reservation, that reservation. Now Marathas want a reservation. Jats want reservation. Sorry to name communities, but powerful communities, want a slice of the pie. Are you going to become Jagat Guru by doing this? So, in other words, my point is simply that we shouldn't infantilize our people, and we shouldn't constantly, be statist. Statist means you want the state to do everything. The state should take control. Government ko karna chahiye. No, we should do things. People like you and me should do things and talk about these things and be open about them and debate them. And as I said, as somebody said before me, even in CPFC, you can debate. You can say, look, this sends out a really wrong signal. You're demoralizing the forces. Then the filmmaker can say, you know what? I think you're right. I'm going to change this. I'm going to show it slightly differently. I'm going to show nuance. Or if someone says, these are MB words which are really, really disgusting. It's vile, it's demeaning, it's misogynistic. Then the person says, okay, maybe I will show things in a different way. So I think that, in other words, what I'm saying is that art is also negotiation between the consumer and the producer and the stakeholders. So, and these are the forums, like, you talk, I mean, I wish movie reviewers had so much power. I mean, I wish, we were Pauline, Kael and Variety, and I'm sorry. I've reviewed hundreds of books. Nobody reads reviews. Nobody reads books, frankly, very few. I'm not saying nobody. So books have become accessories, today we want to show off books. And so, there are contrary trends in our society. That's what I'm trying to say. And there's always going to be a tussle between, narratives. And I think the critical spirit is really important. And in the name of patriotism, or in the name of national integration, or in the name of whatever it is, these sacred symbols of our society are, we should not shut down debate, and at the same time, there should be, as I said, there should be dissent of dissent. I've just seen a book on the 50 years of JNU, and there's not a single voice in it other than a left liberal voice. And you read all these great people in the book, including Abhijit Banerjee, and you know what they say? The best part of JNU was the dhaba, was the adda. Nobody talks about what happened in classrooms. So what I'm trying to say is that things are being massaged left, right, and center. And the best safeguard is an educated, if not educated, at least intelligent, self-aware populace, and not a dumbed down, simplified, and infantilized public.
Thanks. Thank you. Shubhra, I want you to weigh in on this, on the Hindu-Muslim sort of divide in the film, in films that may be made in the future because of how it is in society right now. You're muted. You're muted.
Yeah. Okay. Back. I want to take us back to the 60s, where the Muslim social was a very, very popular mode of showing a Muslim parivar and a Muslim universe, but a lot of that was it was like a little bit of a ghetto. In fact, in that ghetto, a Muslim Nawab or a Nawabzadi or the friends, they had the freedom to negotiate, romance of their own kind, or to have their little rebellions. But a Muslim social remained a Muslim social because there were no sort of outgoes from there, in goes. It was a universe that had been created. It was fine. Savan Kumar Tak making all of those films with the green shararas and the gararas, and Wahida Rahman biting on a diamond, and in all of those fabulous films. But they were films that contained the Muslim, the character. They were always flowery, they were always doing adakari, they were always doing shairi. They were not people like you and me. Once the 60s, sort of went into the past, in the 70s, there was really no time. I think in the mid 70s, when things started to change, when Amitabh Bachchan became number 1 to number 10, and no other kind of cinema was allowed to be because he just took over the whole narrative. From he fought and he danced and he did comedy and he did everything. So basically, all kinds of genres of cinema that used to flourish became extinct nearly. And by the 80s, the Muslim social was gone. It's very interesting to see that the Hindu main character had a Muslim friend, but it was always, the lead character was always Hindu. The Muslim character was a character who would sacrifice, who would do the, it was a trope, whether it was a Hindu trope, a Hindu best friend, a BFF, Hindu Muslim, they would sacrifice their love for the main character, who would almost always be Hindu. In 1994 came Hum Aapke Hain Kaun, which I do believe that with the confluence of Ramayana and Mahabharat and HAHK, the kind of universe that was shown, where everything, the big Hindu joint family had a Muslim character, but the Muslim character is someone who is in service to this family. They have their little nok jhonk, but they are both the Muslim character and the girl they have their 5 minutes on. Everything else is a great Hindu joint family. And that, I think that film was such an influencer that it became the mode of showing all kinds. Muslim characters nearly disappeared from popular mainstream cinema because there really was no place for them. We are not very happy to, even today, we are not happy to accept a Haider or a Shahid. Hansal Mehta made a movie called Shahid 6 years ago, which was about a real life character called Shahid, and the thing that happened to him. It's when I was doing research for my book and I was looking at Muslim characters who are lead character, there are barely any. They are tropes. There's a Muslim best friend, there's a Parsi, there's a Sikh, there's a Sardar. They will always have their little appointed places in this universe that we create for our mainstream cinema. And it's even today, it's very, very hard to actually have a film which has a Muslim character who's like you and me. It's only in the last 10 years, I would say, that there have been names like Altaf or Ahmad, and who have not worn their sherwani and their topis and bowed and said Mohtarma and, all of that stuff. There have been people like you and me. It's now starting to happen. But again, whether this is the kind of film which is it's not Massy, the Massy kind of film with the Muslim character is almost always a terrorist. My Name is Khan became the kind of movie that it was because this autistic character was said, I am not a terrorist. My name is Khan and I'm not a terrorist. Okay. He could say that with the Shiv Sena. The Shiv Sena said, how can you say this, right? Remember that big thing that had happened, yeah? And then when Thackeray gave it the blessing, then Shah Rukh Khan's film came out. Even Fana, for example, when you were talking about it, there were problems with all of these films which have actually gone out there talking about Muslim characters who are not one or the other. They are very, very clearly boxed into categories. They've almost never been this kind of person like you and I, like, somebody who goes to college, has a romance, has a life. It's now starting to happen. But and that's where I think the OTTs come in very handy, because what the streaming platforms have done has, in this last year, what they've taken away the power of the star. You can be an actor and you can still get a fair chance of getting viewership on a streaming platform, which has almost never happened before in Bollywood, because it's always been so star driven. The two movies that have held off and not come onto any streaming platform are the big two, Ranveer Singh's the movie that he made on the World Cup. It's called 83, and Suryavanshi, which is the three cop film with Akshay Kumar. Those are the two blockbuster films which have stayed away from the 9 months that we've locked down, and many films have come onto it, including Amitabh Bachchan's film Gulabo had come on, Sitabo had come on to it was the first big film that came on, and of course many other films. Akshay Kumar's Terrible Lakshmi came on. There are films that are coming on, but there will be those tentpole movies which will stay away from this because they want the theater experience. They still will hold out, I think, for people to get back. So to see what you were talking about, the whole the difficulty right now in expressing or creating a story with a real life Muslim character has always been difficult. It has never been an easy ask, and it is going to get increasingly difficult as far as theaters are concerned, movie halls are concerned, because there you need a lot of people to go see it. And the kind of discourse that has happened in the last 6 years, I think, has been very inimical to that particular kind of person. So when you have a Manikarnika, or you have like a film where the Muslim character or the Muslim invader has got a lot of traction, almost always with no redeeming features, a meat eater has not a single redeeming factor, that kind of film gets a lot of traction. Not the other kind of film where you could be a Muslim character or a Parsi or a Sikh or a Christian or anyone else, and still be able to have to hold your own flag because you're a human being. I think that is becoming, or started to become very difficult when the pandemic happened.
So just one last question. Since so many of our films are about romance, and this I asked earlier as well, is it going to be possible to ever show a Hindu, a Muslim man falling in love with a Hindu girl anymore?
Sushant Singh Rajput's film, 2 years back, what was the film called, in which he plays the Pittu and he falls in love with it. That is a Hindu Muslim.
Kedarnath.
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 Yes, that is a Hindu. That showed a Hindu-Muslim relationship, and that was, it was a big hit. And in all the chest beating that happened after Sushant Singh Rajput's death, and there were all these letters, that film conveniently got sidestepped because everyone else are talking about. If that film had got its viewers, I think some of the narrative for Sushant Singh himself would have been different.
There's one.
Great. I think we are running out of time. And
No, I just want to make one last point. My point is like this Hindu-Muslim films. I would like to know, like, why do we only talk about the Hindu-Muslim films in India? Predominantly, it's a Hindu society. So probably that's the reason why a filmmaker, knowing where his money is going to come back. So in the same reason, how many Muslim-dominated films are made in Hollywood? None. Nobody complains about that. Right. So what I'm trying to say is it's all to do with who is dominating, how many people are going to see what. So like somebody, I don't want to name the person, but we were talking and he said, cinema has become business. So when you make Hindu, when you said the hero is always Hindu and, everybody else is just the, side effects of it, that's probably for the reason that he knows where the money is going to come back from. Otherwise, in Hollywood till now, I haven't seen a Sikh-oriented film. I haven't seen a Muslim, in the lead in the film or in any other cinema. Country by country. That's what my take on that is.
But you've seen Black people in the lead in US cinema, which is, I think, their division. Their primary division is black and white. Our primary division here is more religious. Yes, I'll let you have the last word and then we must close, I think.
Yeah, I think we've, right. I just wanted to say that how many films do you have in which the heroine is Muslim and the hero is Hindu? Bombay, they had to do a huge drama. Mani Ratnam, he had to cut his hand to convince the girl's father. The girl elopes in a burqa. You see, the point is there's an asymmetry between religious traditions. Apostasy is a crime in several Abrahamic faiths. If you're an ex this or that, you could be stoned in earlier times and even today. So it's a one-way traffic usually, and we can't exalt. I'm obviously appalled when you say, oh, such and such a show based on a famous book which I've read and which most people may not have read. It's a very fat book, has a Hindu girl kissing a Muslim boy, so you should ban the show. Well, do you mean to say that that doesn't happen? Obviously, these things happen, but we can't simplify these things. There is a deep politics in it, and we can't be innocent about it. That's my point. Now, the last thing I wanted to say is this Islamicate cinema. That's the name of a book, by the way, and it was written by one of my former colleagues at JNU, Ira Bhaskar. So, the problem with that cinema, think about Pakiza, which is a more complex film than Mere Mehboob. It's about a feudal society and it's a throwback. It's an elegy, to that society. And there are, if you think about Chaudhary Ka Chand, it's a triangle, but some of these, that's where Rahman, the character played by Rahman, eats the diamond and dies. But there's homosexuality. There are all kinds of things in those films which need to be unpacked. It's not just about, I think as Shubhraji said, it's not just about showing, a ghettoized, idealized Muslim community in which there are no Hindus except the Hindu sidekicks, So it's a much more complex issue than I think, the way you framed it. And think about Pakistani serials. They're so popular, but they never talk about religion. They never talk about their minorities. It's a closed society and it's a safe world. I think great art is about making the world just a little unsafe, at least artistically and ideologically.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think unless you push everything off the table, art is basically, it challenges you and it leaves you in a place where you haven't been before. Otherwise, what's the point of art? What's the point of, doing the same thing over again? Status quo is not art. It's basically status quo and it's making your money. It's about, pushing the envelope right off the table. And it's showing you a new world. And that's the only way you can see it. And, unless we see something new, we are not, made anew in that, I think. So I think all cinema should have the power to give us something new every time we go to it. That's the least of it.
Great, fantastic. I think it's been a very interesting discussion, and I could actually ask a few more leading questions to sort of heat it up a bit more, but I think it's now the clock's showing 8:33, and we must tear ourselves away from this. Right. Fantastic having all of you in this panel, and I wish there were people from Bollywood here who were supposed to be, but they backed out at the last minute. And it's a pity that they did, because they could have brought in a lot more, a lot of their insights as well, and this would have been all the more interesting. But hey, we had a wonderful discussion, and lovely meeting you all on this show. Thank you all. Fantastic. Bye-bye.
Thank
Lovely to know Professor Paranjpe has such interest in cinema. We should get offline and have a discussion sometime. Yeah.
Well, absolutely. Let's organize something at IIAS. Let's by all means do that.
Oh, wonderful.
I think the Bollywood folk self-censored themselves out of this, and I think that as academics, we are a little more privileged. We do say, sometimes outrageously controversial things, and views are personal, as they always say. No, I'm not speaking as director IIAS, anyhow.
Okay, bye. They haven't locked us out, so we could actually continue, but I don't think we should. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, no, I was just going to say we certainly should do this, and a film conference is something we can do post-COVID on site, or otherwise even as a webinar. So I guess if they can connect us, exchange emails, let's take this forward.
That would be nice. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Bye. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back. And it is time to say farewell now. But I have to say that this was such an interesting topic and such fabulous conversation. And it's great to know that alliances